down the idea of debt, whether some debt is good, some is bad, or is it really that there's not one size fits all for debt? Maybe it's more about how you use it and what you're comfortable with. There's a lot of gray areas, aren't there, around debt? So let's dig in and just talk about our perspectives on good or bad, or is it just debt?
It was interesting when we started planning for this episode, and we strategically named it good versus bad debt because that's a lot of the messaging that we tend to hear on websites and in the media. And when we had a conversation about it, we all felt like there isn't just a single way to label debt as good versus bad. So I tend to look at debt as the actual categories. So things like mortgage debt, school loans and education loans, those are debts where you're actually investing in something. So you're investing in a home, or with school debt, you're investing in your future income and improving your skills. And then in terms of debt that can be a little more difficult to carry, it's things like consumer debt. So what ends up on your credit cards, those tend to be the debts that are more challenging and tend to bring a lot more stress for people around how to pay it off. The terms may not be as clear in terms of how you can pay off credit card debt. Then there's just more stress associated with those categories of debt. What do you guys think about the good versus bad label that gets attached to debt?
My assumption is that it's different for different people, right? So some people hear the word bad, and that's not necessarily such a negative connotation for them. They're like, oh yeah, bad things, I avoid those. I don't want to have that kind of debt. Good things, okay, those are safer for me. That's okay. But for other people, like depending on their history and their feelings around the word bad or feeling bad, like it could be a whole different scenario, right? And then there can be all of that like guilt and all of those things that come along with feeling like you're bad or you are a bad person. So I think a lot of it is the way people internalize that word or their like history or experience with feeling bad. Um, I I don't love it for myself. I feel like there's different ways that we could kind of categorize them, and maybe we've landed on these good versus bad because they're two short, simple words that like make two very distinct categories. But I tend to agree with you that I don't think that there's just like, for sure, I don't think all debt is bad. I think we are all on the same page with that. And I do think that there's probably more than two categories of debt, right? There's probably more than just good and bad debt. And
Yeah.
we probably need to consider that when we're categorizing things.
Yeah, I would completely agree because another thing that comes to mind when I think about just debt in general, but then also this idea of good versus bad debt is what's the interest rate? And I think a lot of times we get stuck on, oh, it's a high interest rate, so it's bad debt. Well, what is your goal, right? Maybe it is if your goal is just to fill up your closet with the best clothes. Maybe you would say, paying 20% on a credit card, that maybe isn't the best debt for you. But what if it's a high interest rate, but it's to buy a property? As an investment, then we start to ask ourselves. So I think a lot of times we get like stuck, like, oh, it's a high interest rate, it's bad, right? But really there's so much more to it, to actually deciding what are you taking debt for? Is it a home or is it a new purse? So like you guys said, like it's definitely not just good or bad. And I think our brain can easily like attach to those things, but I don't know that that's a very healthy way for us to look at it either. Because there's just, it's really part of our financial life of whether we're going to be repaying something and taking debt on it, or if we're going to pay it in full, right?
I often think about time frames when it comes to debt. And I can remember being in my 20s. I had a student loan, and suddenly you get your own place and you have to furnish it, and all of these purchases come at once when you don't necessarily have the income to support it. So there are these time points where you take on more debt. And then traditionally, as you're closer to retirement, that's when people tend to be more cautious and they start to pay down their debt because they don't want to have additional expenses that can change. And the one issue with debt is you can have a low interest rate, and then suddenly rates change and you're paying a lot more of your monthly income towards debt payments. And we've seen that over the last couple of years. And debt can create so much stress because it has an impact on what you have left over for your other lifestyle expenses. So it's definitely been a topic that I keep seeing over and over and over again. And sometimes the debt we end up with is purely for survival. So if you lose a job, you might need to take on some debt temporarily to get you through a difficult period of time. So, one of the key things to start with is if you are feeling any pressure with your debt or you've lost track of what you might have, is taking some time and starting with a debt inventory where you list out the various debts that you have, what the interest rates are, what your payments are, and just start looking at what types of debt they are, and start understanding how that debt arose. So, with a mortgage, that's an easy one. You decided to purchase a home. With credit cards, it can get a little trickier to figure out where that debt came from. So doing a little bit of reflection on, what each of those debts are.
I love that
Agreed.
idea of really just inventorying where you are now, right? And doing that kind of periodically every 6 months or something. Like, how is it going with my debt right now? Does it feel good or bad to me? You mentioned the word feeling. It's about how we feel, right? We need to feel good about our finances to prevent as much stress as we can. So knowing the facts, having taken that inventory, helps us feel either better, or if it makes us feel worse, then we need to do some reevaluation and make a plan of how to get out of that or change some mindset pieces, don't we?
There's two elements of that I think are so important. One is looking at every single thing, being really honest with yourself. This is just for your eyes to look at. Don't leave something off because you're like, oh, well, that's small. I'll get it paid off later, whatever. Like, just really taking the time to be super honest and writing every single thing down that you owe. And then also doing some, like, having a hard conversation with yourself. Am I justifying some of this spending that I probably is like when I'll speak from my personal experience. When I was using my credit card, there were times when, because I had overextended myself and I had this larger credit card payment now, I was running short on money every month because so much of my income was going to try to pay that down. And so I was then having to use my credit card for the survival things every month because I was paying too much on it. Like, I had gotten myself into this bad cycle. So part of that was me being honest with myself. Do I really need to be charging everything that I'm charging on this card? Does this feel good, or is this debt making me feel more stressed and more overwhelmed? Am I purchasing things that I really don't need, or sometimes even really don't want? It's just in the moment. Sometimes we make those impulsive purchases, or we do spend money to like make ourselves feel better. So I think that part of this inventory is also just really having an honest conversation with yourself about your spending, and not trying to justify, but like really being honest and thoughtful about the debt that you lay out in front of you. Some of it, you're going to be like, this is great. I feel really good about this. This was a great decision. And some of it, you're going to be like, you know what? I didn't need that outfit. I didn't need that bag. I didn't need that fancy dinner out. You know what I mean? And you can kind of think your way through it so that you know how to move forward.